The dog didn't bark. That was the first thing people noticed. Storm, a 110-pound Belgian Malinois with a service record longer than most officers in the room, stood absolutely still at the edge of the formation. His handler, Corporal Brett Ashby, had the leash wrapped twice around his fist. It didn't matter. Storm wasn't pulling. He was just staring, ears forward, nose working. Every muscle in his body locked onto something across the plaza that no human eye had caught yet. The ceremony at CFB Trenton had been running for 40 minutes. It was a Tuesday in late October, the kind of cold that came off Lake Ontario sideways and found every gap in a dress uniform. The flags were snapping. The brass were seated. 6 working dogs from the Canadian Armed Forces K9 unit sat in a single line at the front of the formation. Storm, Havoc, Bricks, Juniper, Kane, and a younger shepherd named Flint, who was still technically in his probationary period. Behind them stood their handlers in full ceremonial dress. Behind the handlers stood officers, NCOs, chaplains, families. Behind everyone else stood the cameras. It was by any measure a controlled event, and then the wind shifted. Storm turned his head to the northwest, then Havoc did. Then, one by one, like a slow current moving through the line, all 6 dogs oriented toward the same point, a gap between the crowd barriers near the old logistics building, where a young woman stood alone at the edge of the pavement. She wasn't dressed for a ceremony. She was wearing a canvas work jacket the color of dried mud, dark jeans with a tear at the left knee, and rubber boots that still had dirt on the soles. She was maybe 26, 27. Her brown hair was pulled back without much care. She had her arms crossed, not in defiance, but in the way someone crosses their arms when they're cold and unsure whether they're allowed to be where they are. She looked like she'd come straight from a farm, because she had. Her name was Lena Coulter, and not a single person at that ceremony knew who she was. The first dog to break was Storm. Corporal Ashby would describe it later as less like pulling and more like the leash going weightless. 1 second Storm was sitting. The next he was moving, not running exactly, but covering ground with that low, purposeful drive that working Malinois have, the kind that says, I have located the thing I have been looking for and I am going to it now. Storm, fuss. The command came out sharp, automatic. Storm didn't stop. Ashby dug in his heels. The leash went taut. Storm turned back once, briefly, the way a dog does when it hasn't forgotten its training, but has decided that something matters more. Then he turned back toward the woman at the barrier and made a sound, not a bark, not a growl, but a high, straining whine that sounded almost human. That was when the other 5 dogs started pulling. Major Harold Fenwick, the senior officer presiding, said later that he'd been giving the same ceremony speech for 11 years and had never once lost a dog mid-sentence. He lost 6 that afternoon. Not all at once. They went in succession, each handler trying to hold, each leash going slack in a different way as the dogs found their own angles toward the same destination. Havoc, a Dutch shepherd with 4 deployments behind him, simply sat down and refused to move until his handler loosened his grip. Then he was gone. Bricks, the youngest Malinois in the unit, cleared the rope barrier entirely and drew a gasp from the crowd. Juniper, the only female in the line, didn't run. She walked, head low, tail moving slowly, like she was approaching something sacred. Lena Coulter saw them coming and put one hand over her mouth. She had not meant to cause a scene. She had driven 4 hours from a property outside Havelock with the intention of standing quietly at the back and watching the ceremony from a distance. She hadn't registered to attend. She hadn't told anyone she was coming. She had simply read an article in the Peterborough Examiner about the annual K9 unit ceremony at Trenton and recognized in the photographs a dog she knew. She recognized 5 of them, actually. 3 years earlier, Lena Coulter had been 23 years old, recently dropped out of a veterinary technician program at Fleming College, and working full-time on a 60-acre property in Hastings County that had belonged to her family for 2 generations. The property was a mess. Her father, James Coulter, had been dealing with a back injury that had sidelined him for most of the previous year, and her older brother had moved to Alberta and wasn't coming back. The house needed a new roof. The fencing was falling down in sections. The barn had a floor that flexed in the wrong places, and the land, which had once run a decent beef operation, had been sitting mostly fallow for 3 years while her father tried to figure out what to do next. What Lena had done, largely without a plan, was start taking in dogs. It wasn't a business at first. It wasn't even a decision. Not really. The first dog arrived in a cardboard box, left at the end of their laneway on a January morning, a German Shepherd puppy, maybe 8 weeks old, with a note that said, "Can't keep him. Good dog, please help." Lena had brought him inside and named him Cedar, and told her father it was temporary. Cedar was not temporary. By the following spring there were 4 dogs. By summer there were 9. By the time Lena's father had mostly recovered and started paying attention again, there were 14 dogs living in and around the property, some of them in a converted section of the barn, some of them in the mudroom. One of them, Cedar, always Cedar, in the foot of Lena's bed. "You can't just keep doing this," her father said. "I know," Lena said. She kept doing it. What changed, and what nobody who drove past the Coulter property in those years would have guessed, was that Lena had a gift. Not for taking in strays. Lots of people did that. What Lena had was an instinct for the ones that weren't broken, even when they looked like they were. The ones that had been neglected or underfed or kennelled too long and had come out the other side, not fearful but frustrated, full of energy and drive and nowhere to put it. She'd started, almost by accident, running them through a series of exercises she'd picked up from books and online forums, and one particularly useful YouTube channel run by a retired RCMP trainer out of Kelowna. Scent work. Obstacle courses built from junk lumber and old tires. Search drills in the woods at the back of the property. Tracking exercises through the hayfields. She didn't know what she was doing, not formally. She knew the dogs were good at it. One of them, a black and tan Malinois she called Havoc, before she knew that was his name, could track a scent trail through standing water. She'd discovered this by accident, chasing him through a drainage ditch during a recall exercise, and had stood in the middle of a field at dusk, watching a dog quarterback and forth across wet grass with the kind of focused intensity she hadn't seen in an animal before. She didn't have the vocabulary for it yet. She just knew it was something. She had 14 dogs that spring. Then, over the course of 11 days in April, she had none. The RCMP investigation afterward would use words like sophisticated and targeted, which felt deeply wrong to Lena, who had watched it happen in pieces from a security camera that cost $90 at Canadian Tire. The footage showed a panel van with magnetic panels over the plates. It showed 2 people in dark clothing moving through the property across 3 separate nights. It showed her dogs, Cedar included, being loaded one by one into crates and driven away. It showed Lena's German Shepherd mix, a 3-legged dog named Hatch, who couldn't be kennelled anywhere because he got anxious, sitting in the open barn door watching the last van leave, because Hatch was too old and too obviously damaged to be worth taking. Lena had watched that footage 11 times before she turned it off. The investigation found, eventually, that the dogs had moved through what the detective in charge, an inspector from Belleville named Doyle Macready, described as a pipeline for high-value working-breed animals. Certain dogs were sold to private security contractors in Eastern Europe. Others went to illegal breeding operations. 2 had been taken to a property in New Brunswick that ran an unregistered protection dog training program for clients with money and no patience for regulation. Inspector Macready was careful and thorough and kept Lena updated with weekly calls that she came to dread because they were always professional and almost never hopeful. 8 months into the investigation, he called with something different. "We've recovered 4 of your animals," he said. "They were found at a property near Sussex, New Brunswick, during a search warrant execution. They're in rough shape, but alive. I need you to come down and make an identification." Lena drove to New Brunswick in a borrowed truck with a wire crate in the back. She identified 4 dogs from the 14. One of them was Cedar. He was thin and had a wound on his left shoulder that hadn't been treated properly. But when she crouched at the kennel door, he pushed his head through the gap and pressed his nose against her collarbone, the way he always had, and Lena sat down on the concrete floor of a New Brunswick shelter and did not move for a long time. She brought 4 dogs home. 10 were still missing. Inspector Macready called again, 7 months later, and this time his voice had a different quality. Not quite reluctant, but careful in the specific way of someone who has good news and complicated news at the same time. "We've located 8 more of your animals," he said. "They were recovered in 2 separate operations. 6 of them are in reasonably good condition. 2 are going to need some time." Lena did the math without saying anything. "That's 12, she said. "I had 14. A pause. "I know," he said. "We have an ongoing investigation into the remaining 2. I don't want to give you a timeline that I can't stand behind." She understood. She thanked him. She drove to pick up 8 more dogs and brought them home to a property that was by then fenced properly, staffed by 2 volunteers from the county who'd heard what happened and showed up one Saturday with tools and didn't leave for 3 weeks, and registered with the province as a non-profit working animal rescue. 12 dogs, home, 2 still out there. What Lena did not know, and would not know for another 14 months, was what had happened to those last 2 dogs. They had been sold, separately, to a broker in Montreal, who specialized in placing high-drive, working-breed dogs with institutional clients who needed trained animals quickly and didn't want to wait the 2 or 3 years it took to develop one from puppyhood. The broker was not a criminal in the way the original thieves were. He operated in a legal gray zone that Inspector Macready described as frustrating to prosecute. And he had sold both dogs to legitimate buyers. One had gone to a private security firm in Toronto. One had gone to the Canadian Armed Forces K-9 procurement stream, where he had been assessed, found exceptional, and given the name Storm. Storm had gone through the military working dog program in 14 months, faster than average. His assessment records noted exceptional olfactory sensitivity, high drive, low anxiety in high-stimulus environments, and, noted twice in different sections, an unusual tendency to become visibly distressed when exposed to the scent of certain organic compounds associated with rural livestock operations. The assessors had flagged it as a minor quirk and moved on. The compound was hay, cedar-scented hay, specifically, the kind that had been bedded under Storm's kennel for the first year of his life, on a 60-acre farm outside Havelock, while a 23-year-old woman who didn't know what she was doing taught 14 dogs to track through drainage ditches. By the time Lena read the article in the Peterborough Examiner and drove to Trenton on a Tuesday morning in late October, Storm had been a certified military working dog for 2 years and 8 months. He had done a deployment, a training exchange, 2 public demonstrations, and approximately 600 routine duty days. He had not, in any of that time, been near anyone who smelled like that farm until now. Corporal Brett Ashby would spend considerable time in the days following the ceremony trying to explain to people that what they'd seen was not the dogs going wild, or losing their training, or any of the other things the video, which had been recorded on at least 4 phones, and was online within 90 minutes, seemed to suggest. What they'd done, he would say, was demonstrate an extremely high-value target odor response to a known subject, which was a very professional way of saying they remembered her. Storm reached Lena first. He didn't jump. Storm never jumped. It wasn't in his profile. What he did was push the full weight of his head against her sternum and stand there, trembling, making that whine that Ashby had never heard from him before in 3 years of partnership. Lena put both hands on either side of his face and held him. "Hi," she said. That was all. Just that. Havoc came in behind and pressed against her left leg. "Bricks, who was 19 months old and had never met this woman in his life, but had grown up kennelled beside Storm and Havoc and absorbed some portion of their certainty that this person was important, sat down at her feet and looked up at her with an expression of complete conviction. Juniper put her head in the crook of Lena's elbow. Kane, a shepherd who had been assessed as having one of the lowest emotional reactivity scores in the unit's history, made a sound no one present could accurately describe and pressed his nose into her jacket pocket. The pocket smelled like dog treats. Cedar was not there. Cedar was home, 11 years old now, with a shoulder that had never healed perfectly and a habit of sleeping in the exact center of whatever bed he was offered. He had earned that. Sergeant Maureen Galliard, the unit's NCO, stood at the edge of the rope barrier and watched 6 of the best working dogs she'd ever served, press themselves against a young woman in rubber boots, like they were trying to climb back into a life they'd been taken from. She looked at Major Fenwick. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything, because there was nothing that needed to be said in that moment. The ceremony could wait. It had been waiting, in a sense, for almost 3 years. Someone in the crowd asked eventually who she was. The question passed through the gathered officers and families in pieces. Who is she? Does anyone know? Is she with the unit? Until it reached Inspector Macready, who had driven down from Belleville that morning specifically because he'd gotten a call from a constable who had, entirely by coincidence, been at the ceremony as a guest and recognized Lena Coulter's name on a visitor registration she hadn't actually filed, but whose vehicle had been logged by base security when she pulled in. Macready walked to where Lena was still crouched on the pavement, one arm around Storm's neck, while Sergeant Galliard stood nearby doing her best impression of a person who was not emotionally moved. "Mrs. Coulter," he said. She looked up. Her eyes were red. She didn't apologize for it. "Inspector," she said. "I didn't know you were coming. I didn't plan to," she said. I saw the photo, in the paper, and I recognized Storm." Macready looked at the dog, who had his eyes closed and his face pressed against Lena's shoulder. "His file name is actually B114, Macready said. "Before they renamed him." Lena frowned slightly. "His file name," she repeated. "The dog you called Havoc," Macready said carefully, "was filed under a procurement designation before they named him for service. We've been cross-referencing those records for the past 4 months." He paused. "I was going to call you next week." She stared at him. "Both of them," she said. "Both of them," he said. Major Fenwick, to his considerable credit, made a decision in the next 3 minutes that he would later describe as the easiest call of my career. He walked to the microphone. He told the assembled crowd that the ceremony would be resuming shortly, and that before it did, he wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the presence of a guest whose contribution to the Canadian Armed Forces K-9 program, while unofficial and entirely unintentional, had been significant. He told them about a 23-year-old woman who had taken in 14 dogs on a property outside Havelock with no formal training and no funding. He told them about 14 nights in April when those dogs had been stolen. He told them about 4 years of investigations and recoveries, 12 dogs found, 2 unaccounted for, and a woman who had driven 4 hours on a Tuesday morning because she'd seen a photograph in a newspaper and thought she recognized a face. He told them that 2 of the 6 dogs currently sitting in formation, Storm and Havoc, he used their civilian names, had been trained in their first year of life by the woman standing at the barrier in the rubber boots. The crowd was quiet when he finished, the kind of quiet that has weight to it. Then Sergeant Galliard, from somewhere behind him, led the applause. It was not polite applause. It was the kind that starts in the chest rather than the hands, and it went on for longer than anyone would have expected at a military ceremony on a Tuesday afternoon in October. Lena stood at the barrier with Storm on one side and Havoc on the other, and she looked like she didn't quite know what to do with any of it. There were questions, of course. Corporal Ashby wanted to know about Storm's obedience in that first year. Specifically, he wanted to know how she'd gotten a Malinois puppy to drive that hard on a scent trail without formal odor imprinting. Lena told him about the drainage ditch and the wet grass and watching Storm work in the failing light. Ashby looked at his dog with an expression that suggested he was revising several assumptions. Sergeant Galliard walked Lena through the 6 kennels and let her spend time with each dog without a handler present. Flint, who hadn't been one of hers, pressed himself against her anyway, apparently unable to distinguish between a person 5 dogs had decided to trust and a stranger. Galliard noted this in the small notebook she kept in her breast pocket and did not remark on it. A logistics officer whose name Lena didn't catch brought coffee in a paper cup and asked if she needed to call anyone. She said no, she'd texted her father from the parking lot. He had replied, "Cedar is fine. Been asleep since you left. Drive safe." She thought about that, about Cedar, 11 years old, sleeping in the sun, about Hatch, who had watched the van leave from the barn door and couldn't be taken because he was too old, about the 10 dogs who had come home and the 2 who had come home differently, in uniform with names she hadn't given them. She thought about the 2 she still hadn't found. She asked Inspector Macready, quietly, while the ceremony was reforming behind them, whether there was still anything active on the remaining file. He didn't answer immediately. "The 2 remaining animals from your original 14, he said, were part of a 3rd transfer that we've been working on for some time. There's an active file. I can't tell you more than that right now." He paused. "But I want you to know that it's active. It's not closed." Lena nodded. She understood what he was telling her, which was that he hadn't forgotten, and that she shouldn't either, and that the word active was doing a lot of work in that sentence. "Okay," she said. "Give me your number," he said, "and when I have something, you'll hear it from me before anyone else." She gave him her number. She already had his. The ceremony resumed at 3:30, later than planned, with the autumn sun dropping fast toward the tree line to the west. The 6 dogs returned to formation. Storm sat in the 2nd position from the left, the same place he'd been in before, and when Corporal Ashby ran through the obedience sequence, heel, sit, down, stay, Storm executed each command with the precision of a dog who had been working for 3 years and knew exactly what he was doing. But once, in the middle of the long stay, his eyes moved to the barrier. Lena was still there. She hadn't left. Storm held the stay. He was a professional. He understood the difference between duty and longing, or at least behaved as though he did, and he did not break again. But his eyes moved, just that once, and a man standing next to Lena, a veteran in his 70s with a Legion pin on his jacket, saw it happen. He looked at the dog. He looked at the woman beside him. "He yours?" the man asked. Lena considered the question. "He was," she said. "Now he's theirs." A pause. "He's both, I think." The man nodded slowly, the way people nod when they've heard something true. The video went up at 5:47 p.m., shot by a woman in the crowd whose son was a handler in training. It was 43 seconds long. It started with the shot of the formation, then caught the moment Storm began to move, and ended on Lena's face. Not the moment the dogs reached her, but the 2 seconds before, when she could see them coming and hadn't done anything yet, just stood there with her arms uncrossing and her face doing something complicated that didn't have a single name. By the following morning, the comments were running into the thousands. Most of them said some version of the same thing. They didn't forget her. A few asked about the other dogs, whether they'd all been found. Whether there was more to the story, there was. 14 days after the ceremony at CFB Trenton, Inspector Doyle Macready called Lena Coulter at 7:12 in the morning. She was in the barn. She could hear Cedar moving around in the mudroom through the open window. "We've found them," Macready said. She sat down on a hay bale. "Both?" she said. "Both," he said. "They're in a facility in Drummondville, Quebec. They were flagged in an inspection of a registered breeding operation that turned out to be substantially less registered than advertised. They're going to need a veterinary assessment before anything else, but they're alive. They're in reasonable condition given the timeline. Lena was quiet for a moment. "What are their names?" she said. "What did they call them?" A pause while he checked something. "The records show them as Bolt and Lady," he said. She almost laughed. "Their names are Tide and Marrow," she said. "A chocolate lab and a shepherd mix. I got them both the same week." "You can give them their names back," Macready said. "You'll need to come to Drummondville for a formal identification, but after that, assuming the veterinary assessment clears, they're yours." She didn't say anything for a moment. In the mudroom, Cedar bumped into something, made a small complaining noise, and went quiet again. "Mrs. Coulter," Macready said. "You still there?" "I'm here," she said. I'm here." She drove to Drummondville on a Friday with Cedar's old blanket in the back, because Tide had always slept on Cedar's blanket, and she thought that continuity might matter. It was a 4-hour drive. She listened to the radio for the first hour, and then turned it off and drove in silence through the St. Lawrence Valley, while the fields went flat and the sky went wide and grey the way it does in Quebec in November. The facility was a converted agricultural property on the outskirts of town. The inspector there was a woman named Lawrence Bedard, who spoke English with a careful precision that suggested she was being courteous and didn't have to be. "The chocolate one was easy to document," Inspector Bedard said. "The shepherd mix we had some questions about because the markings didn't match the description in the original theft report exactly, but the microchip confirmed." "I microchipped them all myself," Lena said, "at a clinic in Maddock, in November, 3 years ago." Inspector Bedard nodded. "That's what closed it for us." She brought Lena to the kennels. Tide heard her before he could see her. The sound he made was not the strained whine Storm had made at Trenton. It was lower, almost conversational, like a dog who had been waiting for a specific person to come through a specific door and was now saying, "Ah, there you are, finally. What took you so long?" He pressed his head against the kennel door and held it there until she got the latch open, and then he stepped out with enormous careful dignity, sniffed her once from boots to shoulder, and sat down in front of her and looked up. Tide had always been like that, precise, deliberate, sure of himself. Marrow, the shepherd mix, came out sideways and put her face in Lena's stomach and stayed there. Lena held her for a long time in the concrete corridor of a municipal facility in Drummondville, while an inspector with careful English stood nearby and asked no questions at all, because there were none that needed asking. She drove home in the dark, Cedar's blanket in the back now carrying 2 sleeping dogs who had been gone for almost 4 years. Cedar was waiting at the mudroom door. He was 11 years old and arthritic, and his shoulder had never healed right, but he stood at the door and watched the headlights come up the laneway and did not sit down until Lena opened the back of the truck, and Tide and Marrow jumped out and landed in the frozen grass. There was a moment, 3 or 4 seconds, when all 4 of them stood in the dark. Then Cedar walked forward and sniffed Tide once, sniffed Marrow twice, then turned around and went back inside, satisfied, as if he had simply been waiting to confirm the count. Lena stood in the laneway for a while after that. The night was cold the way Ontario nights get cold in November, the kind that makes the stars look closer. She could hear the dogs moving around inside. She could see the light in the barn where the others were kennelled, the sound of them shifting in the straw. 14 she had started with, all 14 now accounted for. 2 of them in service, 2 of them just come home, 10 already here, waiting in the light of the barn like they'd never stopped. She went inside.